In this video, you and I get to take a close look at choosing the correct controls as they affect the issues of confidentiality, data integrity, and availability. Let's begin. I'd like you to consider with me this three-legged stool right here. Each of the legs are going to support the weight, hopefully, of the person who is sitting on that stool. In the world of information security, we have three primary aspects that we think about, and each one of them can be thought of as a separate leg in a three-legged stool. If we lose any one of these legs, it's going to compromise our security. And those three legs are confidentiality, data integrity, and availability. And this is no shock to you. We've talked about CIA before, and sometimes these three are referred to as the security triangle. And what you and I get to do in this video is we're going to take a look at some of the control types that we would use to implement and help reinforce each of these aspects in our security triangle. One of the really cool things that I love about cloud-based services is that if we are a service provider, if you and I are a service provider, we can have massive amounts of hardware, and we really can get every ounce of power out of that hardware. And that's because we might have multiple customers in that cloud computing environment where those customers are actually using little slivers or portions of that hardware. So as a service provider, we can maximize the use of that hardware. And the service provider also can move stuff around. If he needs to move customer A over to different hardware for capacity needs, we've got controls up in the cloud as a service provider to do all of that. Another really cool benefit of using the cloud from a customer perspective, let's say Bob's company is down here, is that with cloud computing, it's scalable. For example, if Bob's business is going to grow and next year he's going to need twice as many servers or 3 times as many servers or 3 times the computing power on a single server, the scalability is really easy. We just buy more services like a utility from the service provider in the cloud. And let's say, for example, that Bob's company has 10 servers up in the cloud all running. Maybe they're using infrastructure as a service. And the company discovered that on weekends, the load on those servers isn't very much. For example, 2 of the 10 servers can go ahead and cover the entire load. So another feature that's really attractive is a feature called elasticity, or an elastic cloud computing environment, like a rubber band, how it can bend and be flexible. So what Bob's company could do, they could go ahead and have all 10 virtual servers running as part of infrastructure as a service during the weekdays, and then have it automatically reduced down to 2, for example, on the weekends. And one of the benefits of that is they don't have to pay as much on the weekends as far as a bill to the service provider because they're not actually using all those services. They're only using a portion of them on the weekends. So the question is, okay, Keith, how does this tie into confidentiality? Well, in this type of an environment, it's really important for the service provider to keep one customer's data and infrastructure and services separate from another. Because if customer A can see customer B's data when they shouldn't, that would be a breach of confidentiality. So one method that we can use, whether we're in the cloud or we're on physical disk, is we could go ahead and encrypt the data. And when we encrypt the data, only the person or entity that has the correct keys to unlock that data can make any sense of it. So for example, on Bob's local hard drive right here, we could use encryption. Or if Bob's using a cloud service like Dropbox or some other storage service in the cloud, Bob could also choose to encrypt data that he's storing up in the cloud on his own. So even if the cloud service provider is doing their own encryption of Bob's data as it sits on their storage in the cloud, Bob can also do his own encryption on that data. And that's one primary way to implement confidentiality so that unauthorized individuals don't have access to see the data. Now, if Bob is going to use cloud services for storage, like Dropbox, for example, Bob can choose to encrypt individual files that he's storing in Dropbox. And typically the way that would work is Bob would store the local files on his local computer, he would encrypt them on his local computer, and those individual files would be copied as encrypted files up into the cloud. And that's a cool benefit of file by file encryption, is that if the files are moved to another media, for example, let's say Bob takes these encrypted files that are sitting on his computer and he copies those encrypted files over to another server somewhere else, or they get copied automatically up to the cloud as a backup, those files are encrypted. They're still encrypted, sitting here or on the cloud or on the hard drive if we did file by file encryption. And that's pretty cool because it allows a file that's been encrypted to stay encrypted as it's copied wherever it's being moved to. Now, on the other hand, if we did a disk encryption, we're talking about full disk encryption of this hard drive, the way it would work is this. Bob would power on his PC, and then he might have to supply a password initially to unlock, if you will, or to decrypt the data on that whole physical drive. But then the difference is, and this is important, is that let's say that Bob now is working with his drive and his data, and let's say that Bob has a whole bunch of files that he is either synchronizing up to the cloud or copying over to a external storage. Because the files themselves that Bob's actually working with are no longer encrypted, if Bob copies files out to an external server or if they're synchronized up to the cloud, because he's already unlocked his whole disk, he's actively working with the files, the individual files that are in their unencrypted state, as he copies them over to external servers or as they're synchronized up to the cloud, will not be protected. So I suppose the next question is, could we use both? And the answer is absolutely yes. We could have full disk encryption, and then once we've accessed that disk and we start working with the files, we could then also, if we wanted to, encrypt each and every file. And a lot of that depends on the sensitivity of the files and systems that you're dealing with. And one great application for disk encryption is with our portable devices. For example, if we have a phone or other smart device that has a lot of sensitive data on it, if the entire media, and in the case of a portable device, is going to be a flash drive of some type, but if that media, whether it's removable or not in that smart device, like a smartphone, if that is encrypted, then if somebody steals our phone or they steal that removable media and the whole disk or the whole system is encrypted, they won't be able to get at that data. And again, the reason for that is we want to maintain the confidentiality of our data. Another item that we might want to make sure we keep confidential, we could do that through encryption as well, is personally identifiable information. Things like social security numbers, birth dates, and so forth that we are holding as part of our normal course of business. We don't want to leak that out to the wild. We want to keep it safe. So we might use encryption to help enforce that. And that could be encrypting files, it could be encrypting databases, it could be encrypting disks. It's all about the concept of protecting that sensitive data so it's not seen by unauthorized individuals. And that's the primary reason we're doing encryption. Now, sometimes, in fact, quite often, we'll also throw in some integrity checking along with the encryption. And we'll get to that in just a moment here with integrity checks. But the primary, the number one reason for encryption is data confidentiality. Let's take this server right here. It's on our DMZ. And let's say that you and I have set up that server to become a web server so that customers on the outside could go ahead and log in. And then if they wanted to, they could verify their account information or change their account information or check status, what have you. And let's say we have a couple users. Let's say we have Zach. And let's say we have Kurt and Tyson and a few other users on the outside who want to go ahead and connect in. Now, here's my question. When Zach connects, should he be able to look at all of Kurt's information? Or when Tyson connects, should he be able to see all of Zach's information? The answer is, of course not. We need some separation there. We need some technical controls to make sure that only specific people can see their information. And that's all about access controls. And primarily, we're talking about technical controls that assist us in making sure that we're not sharing information above and beyond what an individual should be able to see to that individual. And in an upcoming video in this course, we'll take a look at mandatory access control and discretionary access control and role-based access control and a few more concepts that apply directly to that. But here in the concept of confidentiality, by implementing the correct technical controls, that can assist you and I in making sure that we only give the information that's supposed to be allowed and not any more. And that can help us in maintaining the confidentiality of that data by avoiding sharing sensitive information with unauthorized individuals. Steganography is a fantastic and very effective way of doing encryption, which in this case is enforcing our confidentiality of the data that we are encrypting. Steganography is hiding data inside of other data. For example, let's say that Bob, on a bad day, Bob decides, you know what, I'm going to the dark side. I'm going to sneak out company information, and I'm going to use cryptography, specifically steganography, to do it. Here's what Bob could do. Bob could take a file, let's say a music file, 1.mp3, some fairly innocent music file that he may have access to on his computer, and then he could take another file like sensitive.docx. And what he could do is use a program like OpenPuff to secretly hide this sensitive document inside of his MP3 file. Now, the result of him running this process is that he's going to actually have two files. He'll have the original 1.mp3, and let's say that's 4 megabytes in size. That's the original file. And then with that file acting as a carrier, it could be named exactly the same. From a file system perspective, it would need to be in a different folder, because most operating systems are not going to be too happy with the same exact file name in the same exact folder. So maybe we put this file that now has a sensitive document encoded into it in a separate folder, has the same name, but maybe now it is 4.1 megabytes in size. It's slightly bigger. And then what Bob could do, he could possibly email this carrier file to himself, or he could store it in cloud storage, which he might have access to outside of the company. And then after he has access to the carrier file, which by the way will still play the music and still act like the original file, he can then extract using the same program he used to encrypt the data to now decrypt the data using the same keys involved. And that would give him, again, access to the sensitive documents outside of the company infrastructure. Let's take a moment and walk through an example of using OpenPuff for steganography. First, we're going to click on Hide in OpenPuff. The first question it asks us is our passwords that we're going to use. I'm going to go ahead and disable most of the security, and I'm going to use a simple password to encrypt the data. Now, this password that I'm going to use right here, I also need to use when I decrypt the data. The next thing it's asking me for is the data that I want to hide. So I'm going to click on Browse and browse for it. I've got this secret document right here. I'm going to go ahead and double click on it. It's a very small text file. And now in section 3, it's asking me, okay, what file do you want to hide the original file into? So I'm going to select an MP3 file because I have one handy right here. So I'm going to click on Add. I'm going to click on this Coast to Coast song. You could also play with the settings over here. I'm going to leave the defaults. And then click on Hide Data in the bottom right. It's now asking, where do you want to put this carrier file? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put it in the results folder, which at the moment is empty. We'll click on OK. And it's now encoded my text document into the MP3 file. And there's a summary of the results. Now this carrier file, which is sitting in the results folder, if we right-clicked and said go ahead and play it, I'm going to open it up with VLC. You notice it still plays fine. It works great. It's just an MP3 file. However, there is embedded in it our sensitive document. So let's go ahead and extract the sensitive document from this file. To extract it, we'd go back to OpenPuff, and we're going to say unhide. It's going to ask me for the keys I used to encrypt it, and that's because with symmetrical encryption, we'd use a key or keys to encrypt the data and the same exact keys and methods to decrypt the data. And that's what keeps it secure and confidential. Only those individuals or systems that have access to the correct keys can unlock encrypted data. So I'm going to supply the password there. I didn't change the defaults over here on the right, so I'll leave those as they are. I've got to identify who the carrier is, so I'm going to click on Add Carriers. I'm going to go to the Results folder. There's my carrier. I'm going to double click on him. And then over here on the bottom right, I'm going to click on Unhide. And I'm also going to put the results in the Results folder. I'll click on OK. And what should happen over here on the left, we should have that document show up. Here's a little review screen of what happened, and there's our secret document right there once again. So that's an example of encrypting and decrypting using steganography, hiding one file inside of a carrier or second file. I'd like you to imagine that Lois is in charge of all the updates to this firewall. Now, that firewall could also be doing IPS and other advanced mitigation services against attacks on the network. And you might ask, well, what happened to Bob? Bob has been so good this whole time. Well, due to the steganography issue, Bob has been identified and he's been fired, and now he's facing charges for stealing company data. So for the rest of this video anyway, we're going to have Lois in charge of the updates to this firewall. Now let's imagine further that it's Wednesday and Lois gets an email indicating that there's a new update for the firewall. It was at version 28.3 and now we're going to go to 28.4. And this update, although it's minor, does have some features that Lois wants to take advantage of, or it helps mitigate some vulnerability that was discovered. Now, of course, we know that Lois would go through proper change control process and procedures She wouldn't just update the software and say, I hope it works. She'd have the whole thing approved with change management. And part of getting that update on this firewall would be to download the new version and actually put it local on the network and then copy it over. And they may use TFTP or SCP or some other mechanism to copy that over to the firewall. Now the question I have is this: how does Lois know that she got the correct copy of 28.4 that the vendor intended her to get? What if some malicious party created a version 28.4 that had security holes and backdoors in it, hoping that Lois would download their hacked version of 28.4 and hoping that Lois would implement that? Well, one method that Lois could use to verify the integrity of that file that she downloaded from the internet, hopefully from the vendor site, is to use a technique called hashing. And it goes something like this. Lois goes up to the cloud, for example, let's say it's Check Point, and she's downloading a new version of software. This is also true for other vendors like HP and Juniper and Cisco and so forth. And what they would have the file 28.4. They would have details about that file, including something called a checksum or hash. And it's going to be this long string of characters. And the way the Check Point got this hash value against the file is they took the file, let's say the file is 20 megabytes in size. They take the file and they run a hashing algorithm against that. And a hash algorithm is a one-way transform. You cannot reverse engineer it. So they run this hashing algorithm against that 20 megabyte file and they get this hash value. Maybe it's an MD5 or a SHA-1 hash. Some value. And then what Lois can do is she can download the version 28.4, the 20 megabyte file from Check Point. As she downloads it, once it's sitting on her computer, she can go ahead and run the same hashing algorithm against that file. And here's the secret. The hash that's generated by the vendor running a hash algorithm against the file, if that hash is the same as the one Lois created when she ran that hash algorithm against the file, it means that we have data integrity. Integrity in this context is all about making sure that the data hasn't changed. The file that Lois is currently looking at and ran the hash against is the same file that the vendor is supplying. Because if Lois had somehow gotten a compromised version of that file that had some malicious code in it or anything else, when she runs a hash against that compromised file, the resulting hash will be different than what the vendor advertised the hash should be. Then she'll know that that file is not the exact file, that something has happened to it, and that it has lost its integrity. All due to using a hashing algorithm to verify data integrity. Or in the case of a mismatched hash where the hash doesn't match, it would be a lack of integrity, which would prevent Lois, or hopefully prevent her from continuing forward because she knew something was wrong with the file that she had. So in any secure environment, when we're downloading software, and before we deploy it to any production system, we would want to use a hash to validate the integrity of that downloaded software by comparing it to the hash provided by the vendor. And each vendor is going to have specific details on how to verify the hash. So a big piece about doing weekly or monthly or periodic updates to a network device or system is to, in addition to using proper change control and getting the authorization and the maintenance window all set up and the backout procedures all defined beforehand, as part of that change control, we should also implement a step to validate the hash on the downloaded software to mitigate any risks of bringing corrupted or compromised software as part of a production system. Now, data integrity is all about not having the data altered by an unauthorized person. And in the olden days, what they might do is have a king or some other high-ranking officer, if they wanted to write out a document saying, "Hi, Mom," for example, then they could drop some wax and they could actually put their seal on that. And that way, when it's delivered, somebody looking at the seal and seeing that it's not broken could go ahead and open that document. And the purpose of that seal could help verify the data had integrity, that it hadn't been opened or modified in transit from one party to the other. Now today, in the 21st century, we can also do a form of a seal on documents. And in a digital format, this is referred to as a digital signature. So for example, Lois, if she was going to download a file before she deployed it on the firewall, if she's downloading it from the vendor, instead of generating her own hash against that file and comparing her hash against the hash that the vendor said it should be, another option might be that the vendor digitally signed the file. So effectively what that means is when Lois downloads it, she then looks at that digital signature, verifies whether or not it really is the signature of the vendor, and if it is, that's another way of verifying data integrity, because the file was signed by the vendor. Another time that we can use digital signatures is to verify the entity that we're communicating with or who we're talking to. For example, maybe Lois has just received an email from Kyle. So Kyle sent an email message to Lois. She's about to read it. Now the question is, should Lois trust this email? Is it really from Kyle? And is the attachment really the attachment that Kyle sent? How can she know? Well, that's yet another time that we can use a digital signature to help verify that. Kyle can go ahead and digitally sign the email, and then he can send it to Lois, along with any attachment that might be in that email. Lois, when she gets the email, she goes ahead and she verifies Kyle's digital signature, and if that's verified, we've just identified who sent it, and then potentially, if we trust the sender, we could also trust the contents of that email message. Next, let's inject Bob into this picture. Bob is going to pretend to be Kyle, and he's going to do a phishing attack against Lois. He's going to send an email message that is supposed to look like it came from Kyle. Now, when Lois receives this email message that Bob sent that says it's from Kyle, if Lois is expecting Kyle to digitally sign every email, when Bob's email comes in, if it's not digitally signed or if it's signed incorrectly, which would cause Lois to say, whoa, wait a second, I can't verify the digital signature, Lois could presume that that email that she just received is not really from Kyle. It's from some other party who didn't digitally sign it or who tried to sign it but signed it incorrectly. So as a result, let's say Bob is not successful in sending that message, and let's go back to the real Kyle for a moment. And let's say that Kyle has joined in league with Bob and is now going to try to do malicious stuff against the company. So let's say Kyle sends an email. It's digitally signed. It says, hey, this is from Kyle. Lois gets it. She opens it, and there's some malware that's exposed on this local computer that was sent in an attachment from Kyle. Now, because Kyle digitally signed that email message, and that's the reason Lois trusted it, Kyle can't later say, oh, I never sent that email message. Now, Kyle trying to deny that would be called repudiation. And we kind of think of repudiation as the process of denying something. But if Kyle digitally signed that, Lois has proof because she verified Kyle's signature in the email. That would be an example of a digital signature providing non-repudiation, meaning once you sign it and you can be verified, you can't deny that it was you. And that is another benefit of using digital signatures. It provides non-repudiation, which is the concept of saying, hey, Kyle, you sent it, you signed it, it was you, we have proof. You cannot get out of it. You cannot say it wasn't you. And the concept where Kyle is undeniably the person who sent that email message, that is the concept of non-repudiation. It's undeniably you, Kyle, because you digitally signed, in this example, the email message that you sent to Lois. Now, one of the secrets in doing digital signatures is to use something called public and private keys. And I'd like to draw out a couple for you. So I'm going to draw out a public key, and I'm going to draw a private key. And the big piece I want you to notice here is that they are different keys. And together, this public and private key, they make up what is called a key pair. And they use a method called asymmetric encryption. And all asymmetric means is that they don't use the same exact key for encryption and decryption. And the big concept I want to drive home right here with asymmetrical encryption is that we are going to use one key to encrypt data and a different key to decrypt data with asymmetric encryption. And one example of that is using a public-private key pair. And here's how they work. Anything that we encrypt with the public key, and I'll keep the public key in blue here, can be decrypted with the corresponding private key. And on the flip side of that, any data or anything that we encrypt with a private key can be decrypted with the corresponding public key. So anytime we hear the concept of asymmetric, which means not symmetric encryption, I'd like you to think of two keys that mathematically together work as a pair. Anything that one of the keys encrypts, the other key can decrypt, and vice versa. Now, the reason this is important, this ties in to these two concepts, digital signatures and certificates. And here's how it works. Let's say Kyle's computer wants to go ahead and digitally sign something. To digitally sign something, the sender is going to have a public-private key pair. So up here, let's presume that this public and private key are Kyle's. So this is Kyle's set, his public-private key pair. And when Kyle digitally signs something, he is going to basically use his private key. So Kyle, the sender, is going to use Kyle's private key as part of the digital signature process. And then that gets sent over to Lois. Now, if Lois wants to be able to de-encrypt and thus verify Kyle's digital signature, Lois needs to use Kyle's public key. And we'll put arrows right there. So Kyle is using his own private key to encrypt and sign the data, and Lois is going to use Kyle's public key so she can decrypt and thus validate the signature that Kyle has put on the email message. And we'll get more into the details of asymmetric key pairs and how they operate in our cryptography videos coming up. The concept I want to drive home right here regarding digital signatures is that we are going to use a private key to encrypt and to digitally sign data. We're using the private key of the sender, or the signer if you will, for that signature. And the receiver, or the person who wants to verify that signature, is going to need and use the sender's public key to go ahead and decrypt and validate that signature. So before this all began, Kyle generated a public-private key pair. He's got both of those. He's using the private key to sign his email message in this example. And the question is, how does Lois get a copy of Kyle's public key? Because she's going to need that to validate Kyle's signature. And one of the methods that can be used to distribute public key information, for example, Kyle's public key, is to include that public key information in a digital certificate right here. So what Kyle could have done beforehand is Kyle would have created a public-private key pair right here. He would have enrolled with a common trusted certificate authority, for example, GoDaddy and others that are out there on the internet. As part of that enrollment process, Kyle would have given that certificate authority a copy of Kyle's public key. The certificate authority should verify Kyle's identity, that he really is who he says he is. They would include Kyle's public key inside of Kyle's digital certificate and then issue that certificate to Kyle. Now, one of the ways that Lois can get this public key of Kyle's is she can request a copy of Kyle's digital certificate, which has Kyle's public key. And the reason they call it a public key is because that's the key that we are okay with sharing with the public. Kyle's private key he never shares with anyone, but the public key is part of a digital certificate, and that digital certificate can be shared with virtually anybody. So Lois, after getting a copy of Kyle's digital certificate and extracting the public key out of that certificate, Lois will now have Kyle's public key, which she can now use to validate Kyle's digital signature. And we will do a review on the asymmetric encryption process and digital certificates again in the nuggets coming up in cryptography. The other thing that makes it very simple to use digital certificates are companies like GoDaddy and others that are acting as certificate authorities on the internet. And that infrastructure of certificate authorities has a formal name, and it is PKI. It's the Public Key Infrastructure, which gives us the ability to have centralized authorities that we trust acting as certificate authorities who are issuing certificates to individuals like Kyle. And entities like Lois, if she wants to validate Kyle's digital signature, she can first validate that she's getting a certificate that she trusts, if she also trusts that common certificate authority. And if she does, she can trust Kyle's certificate, which was issued by that certificate authority, and then she can extract Kyle's public key from that certificate and use that as part of the verification process. So back to integrity, we can use hashing to validate the integrity of data, or we can use digital signatures, which can validate data integrity, and they can also validate who the entity is that is sending us information, because we can use digital signatures in that process to validate who the sender is. A big part of getting public keys advertised and shared is using certificates, and the main component of a digital certificate is the public key contained in that certificate. And if we are doing digital signatures on data sets or files or emails, that also provides us with non-repudiation. Kyle, we know it was you. You digitally signed it. We verified your signature. There's no way of wiggling out of that one. We know it was you. So in the event of email, we're providing non-repudiation regarding the sender of Kyle. So regarding our scenario with Kyle and Lois, if Kyle digitally signs an email message, we have non-repudiation regarding Kyle, the sender of that email. So effectively, we can hold him accountable for that email that he sent due to the non-repudiation. And again, besides just email, if Lois is doing an update to a firewall or some service that's running on a router, and she's downloading a file, she can either check the hash and compare her own locally generated hash against that file, or the vendor could have digitally signed the update. And then Lois, using the sender's public key, which she likely got from a digital certificate, could validate that digital signature and thus verify the integrity of the attached data that she's working with. Another thing that we would want to be aware of is that let's say that Kyle is sending us emails and we're able to verify Kyle's signature because we have a copy of Kyle's public key. And we got it from a copy of Kyle's digital certificate. And I say a copy because it's just an electronic document that has Kyle's public key signed by a common certificate authority that we both trust. Well, what happens if this workstation blows up one day and we replace it? So we put a new machine in there for Lois, she gets a new email from Kyle, and all of a sudden we can no longer verify Kyle's digital signature. Why? What changed? Well, besides the workstation being changed, it's very likely that with individuals who are digitally signing documents, it's very likely that the previous workstation had a copy of Kyle's digital certificate, which had Kyle's public key. The new computer doesn't have a copy of Kyle's digital certificate, and for that reason, we don't have Kyle's public key and we can't verify his digital signature anymore. So the fix for this was to make sure that on this new computer we had installed or replaced a copy of Kyle's digital certificate, which includes Kyle's public keys, which give us the availability of now verifying Kyle's digital signatures. Now that is a lot of information if you're brand new to asymmetrical encryption and digital certificates and certificate authorities and PKI. So if you'll bear with me just for a second, I'd like to give you a Reader's Digest to kind of cap off what we just talked about. To perform a digital signature, we're going to use the sender's private key, which is part of the sender's public-private key pair that was generated by that sender. To verify a digital signature, we're going to use the sender's public key, which leads us to the question of how did the recipient get a copy of the sender's public key? And the answer is we got the key via certificate. And I'm going to put over here, that's the sender's certificate. The next question might be, if we have the sender's digital certificate, how do we know it's valid, that it has the real public key of that sender? And the answer is we're going to verify a digital certificate, which has a copy of the sender's public key via a common trusted certificate authority, which is part of the PKI, the public key infrastructure. And as we do use digital signatures, we can verify the integrity of the data that's being sent. We can verify the sender. We can have non-repudiation. And those are a few of the benefits about using certificates to distribute public keys in an environment where we're doing digital signatures. Regarding availability, we've talked about these specifically in a previous nugget already. We have redundancy, for example, 2 routers or 2 firewalls to act fault tolerantly together, or 2 servers or a cluster of servers for high availability. And the goal being to not have a single point of failure in the network. So if we do have redundancy, like a high availability pair here for routers or for firewalls or for servers, the key about fault tolerance is that the system as a whole can tolerate a fault. If we lose a single device, like a single router or a single link, because we have fault tolerance, the functional and operational components of that system can keep on going on the remaining components of that fault tolerant system. So if router A is no longer in use, router B is now forwarding traffic. If server A is no longer in use, server B hopefully can carry the load of the remaining traffic. And regarding patching, we definitely want to make sure that we're validating the data integrity, either through hashing or digital signatures, before we deploy any new update, especially if it's a security update. For example, if a vendor has brand new intrusion prevention system signatures and we're about to upload those, besides using our standardized change control procedure and authorization and backup plan in case it doesn't go well, we'd also want to make sure that we either use a digital signature from the vendor or a hashing algorithm to verify that the IPS update we're about to deploy is actually the correct IPS update from the vendor, and that it isn't a hacked or compromised copy of that software that's about to be injected into our network. When I was growing up, we had a family friend. His name was Ken Downs. He has since passed away, but he worked with the fire department, and I remember him telling me this. He said, Keith, he said, do you know what the purpose of a fire extinguisher is? And I said, what, to put out fires? He goes, no. The purpose of a fire extinguisher is to assist you as a human in getting out of the building. And the main emphasis was that we should make sure we preserve life. Don't try to put out a fire if you can't put it out. Use a fire extinguisher to make a path, if you will, for your exit. Because human safety is first and foremost the primary concern in any type of an emergency situation. And that's definitely why we want to have escape plans that are clearly defined. We want to go ahead and have escape routes, or as some people pronounce that in other parts of the world, escape routes. We want to have drills to reinforce what those procedures are so that when the real emergency does happen, we'll be prepared and the right emergency plan can kick in. And by the way, having a drill from time to time is a great way of testing controls to validate that those work. Having proper fencing, the right height and so forth, is a great deterrent against unwanted entities entering the premise. Appropriate lighting is critical anywhere there's going to be humans when there isn't natural light provided. So as part of that planning, you'd have to identify how far apart street lamps are going to be in the parking lot, for example. And they should have some overlap. We don't want any dark spots where it might be an opportunity for a malicious individual to hide, which might lead to a compromise or harm of one of our employees or staff members or guests who are on our property. Having the physical controls and the locks in place, which we've already discussed in a previous video, are critical for security and safety. If we don't want somebody to go into an area because it might cause them physical harm, like a work area or something else to that effect, we want to make it very difficult for the accidental person to just go into that environment, and we also want to make it very difficult for the malicious person also to be able to get into an environment if they're not authorized to be there. CCTV is all about closed circuit television, which is a short way of writing out surveillance cameras. And part of closed circuit TV, it's very likely in public areas that we're going to have those as part of our safety program. It can also act as a detective type of control, where we can have security guards reviewing what's going on all the cameras. If they see activity that shouldn't be going on, they can jump in and get involved. Closed circuit TV can also act as a deterrent if people know there's cameras on the public areas. And we'd want to make sure those cameras also adjust properly to the correct lighting conditions. For example, some cameras have a little row of LED lights that might turn on at night for infrared capabilities. And at the end of the day, we'd want to test and make sure that, okay, during the day, do they work? At night, do they work appropriately? And if they're not, we might want to use some corrective controls and adjust them properly so that we do have the right type of camera and the right settings so we can collect that information. One other aspect regarding closed circuit TV or any type of monitoring devices is time. We'd want to be aware of the time stamping on that system. For a closed circuit TV, hopefully, it's going to be set to local time with the right offset from UTC. And that way, all of the recordings that go to a DVR, recording all the camera information for maybe days or weeks or months, if we need to go back and look at those videos, we want to make sure we have reliable timestamps. And that also has to deal with the offset. For example, if your cameras are recording in UTC time, because that's the company standard, nationwide or worldwide, and you're in Pacific time zone, you'd need to know that, okay, those are 7 or 8 hours, depending on whether daylight savings time is currently on or off. And you'd want to know the offset of that and have all that planned out ahead of time. So in the event we do need to go back and look at specific time frames, or we have to turn in this as evidence as part of a forensics process, either to law enforcement or other internal resources, we want to make sure we're very clear on what the timestamps mean on those DVR videos so they can be useful to us. I have had a lot of fun in this video with you, and I'm glad you joined me for it. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.